Well, this is going to annoy some people. Ranking every MotoGP rider from best to worst. This will be an interesting video. Now, the way I'm doing this ranking is based off, if MotoGP was a spec series where everybody was on the same bike, what would a championship look like? Which means I'll be taking into consideration a rider's speed, his qualifying pace, his consistency, and also how often they crash, because that'll be a big one. There's going to be a lot of controversial takes in this video, so let's start with a pretty safe one, and I've got Augusto Fernandez in dead last. That's right, in my opinion, Augusto Fernandez is by far the worst MotoGP rider on the grid at the moment, and for me it's not even close. This season he has been completely outshone by Acosta, and he is on a factory bike and he has currently scored a grand total of 13 World Championship points after 7 rounds, the same amount as Joan Mir, who's on a Honda. Fernandez has spent this season either being at the back of the grid or crashing. He wasn't particularly brilliant last season either, he just had an even worse teammate in Pol Espargaro who was nearing the end of his career. I'm really not impressed by Fernandez, and I think at the end of this year he will be leaving MotoGP, and for good reason. 21st, second bottom, I've got Takaki Nakagami. Now back in 2020 he would have been a bit higher in this list, but he is well past his peak by now. In the last few years he's been completely outshone by his teammates such as Alex Marquez, Alex Rins and this season Johann Zarco. They're not exactly world beaters, are they? Nakagami never really pulls off a shock result out of nowhere, he sort of just trundles around in about 12th in every race. He never puts out a shock qualifying result, he's just boring, and that's why I've got him 21st in this list. 20th, I've gone with Jack Miller. He is having a terrible season on that KTM right now, and it's looking very unlikely that he'll have a seat for next year. And it's a shame really, because Jack's a really fun personality to have in the paddock, but his performances have been shocking so far, and he's only 29. He seems completely washed. I don't really see how it gets better for him from this point. He's not shown any signs of improvement, if anything he's getting worse. I think to save a bit of pride, he needs to move over to World Superbike at the end of the year, because I do not rate Jack Miller anymore. In the past he was a good rider, but since he moved to that KTM, he's been terrible. 19th. Franco Morbidelli. Morbidelli, when he first joined MotoGP, used to be a class rider, and remember he finished second in the World Championship in 2020, but then an injury in 2021 sort of put that on hold, and he hasn't got a podium since then, and I don't think he's really recovered fully. In all fairness, he has had some very difficult teammates over the last few years. Quartararo and Martin are two of the best riders on the grid, so maybe he's actually doing a better job than we think, but I'm yet to be convinced that he's anything special at the moment. He's an average rider who's good enough to get another year in MotoGP, but he's far from the best. 18th, I've gone with Luca Marini. Now some people would argue that he should be bottom of this list after his performances on the Honda so far. I disagree. He's a decent consistent rider, he's just a bit average, and if every rider was on the same bike, his strength is that he doesn't crash, so I think he'd finish about 18th in the championship. He's far from the fastest rider, but he's consistent, and that's why I've put him 18th. Now for me, the bottom 5, they were quite set in stone for me. I didn't really have any doubts over who would be in the bottom 5. But this is where things start to get interesting, and quite difficult for me to decide. 17th, I've gone with Alex Marquez. Now sometimes Alex Marquez can be a phenomenal rider. We saw in the 2 sprint victories he got last year that he can on his day be a great rider. But he can also produce some absolutely shocking performances, which is why I can't put him any higher in the list. As well as this, he's quite crash prone. On his day, Alex Marquez can be a top 10 rider, but when he's not on his day, he can be one of the worst. Let's say in this scenario, when everyone's got the same bike, he'd finish 17th in a championship. 16th, I've gone with Miguel Oliveira. Now this might be a bit of a controversial one, putting him below his teammate. And the main reason I've done that is because Oliveira crashes a lot. I know last year quite a lot of those crashes weren't necessarily his fault, but if you look over his whole career, he's never exactly been a consistent rider. He's had a lot of crashes, and that hasn't exactly stopped at all this year. I think in the rain, Oliveira is honestly top 5 in the grid. He's incredible in the wet, and he can still produce some very solid performances, but I'd say 16th for now. I think his crashing would put him a lot further down the grid than maybe he should be. And in 15th, I've got his teammate Raul Fernandez. I think this season Raul Fernandez has taken up another step and he's now on level terms of Oliveira in terms of just pure speed. But like I said, he crashes a lot less than Oliveira. So in my eyes, he's slightly better and would finish just above Oliveira in this fantasy world championship. He's a great rider who has a bright future ahead of him. I think in a couple years time he'll be a lot higher in this list, because he's got a lot of potential. Now this is where things really got difficult. In 14th I've gone with Johan Zarco. I still think Zarco is a really great rider. He would still do a decent job on that Pramac bike, and I ultimately think that Pramac have downgraded going from him to Morbidelli. At times this season, especially in qualifying, Zarco has put that Honda bike in places where it really shouldn't be. He's the only one of all the Honda riders who occasionally puts it together and puts in a really good qualifying lap to nearly get into Q2, but the bike just doesn't let him get that far. Even at his age, Zarco is still a really solid rider, and he's talking about going on in MotoGP until 2027, which is brave from him. However, compared to some others, he does crash quite a lot, so I'd say 14th for him. 13th I've gone with Alex Rins. A bit like Alex Marquez, on his day Alex Rins is a phenomenal rider. We saw that when he won a race in USA last year on that absolute shitbox of a Honda. But Alex Rins crashes a lot, possibly the most out of any rider on the grid. Another thing with Rins is it's really hard to tell where he is at the moment, because obviously he had that horrible injury last season in Mugello where he broke his leg. And since then the results haven't really come for him. He still shows some great pace in qualifying and in practice, but he just can't get it together in the race. Now is that a problem on his part or on Yamaha's part? I really don't know. What I do know is Alex Rins is still one of the fastest riders on the grid on his day, so I've got him 13th on this list. 12th, Aleix Espargaro. Aleix of 2022 would be much higher in this list, but I think there's a reason he's retiring, and that is because he's declined over the past 12 months or so. He's still a fine rider, we saw that in Catalonia, but he's just a bit past his best. There has been quite a lot of races this year where he's just languished in about 10th, and he hasn't really been able to hold a candle up to Viñales this year. But he is still a very consistent rider, and he doesn't crash too often. I'd put him 12th in this. 11th I've gone with Joan Mir. That's right, the 2020 World Champion is only the 11th best rider on the grid in my opinion. And to be honest, I think the Joan Mir that won that World Championship is gone. I think the constant crashes on that Suzuki and then Honda has beaten the best out of him. Remember, Mir won that World Championship from never ever crashing, whereas he's now gone to a habit of just crashing in every weekend. I think if Honda do get their act together, and if the bike stops throwing their riders off, Joan Mir I think has lost that edge of him never ever crashing. I think that remarkable consistency from him is gone, and he was never the fastest rider. However, I do still rate him as a rider. The fact that he is doing the best out of all the Honda riders is definitely worth something, and he has crashed slightly less this year. I think in this mystical world I've created where everyone has the same bike, he'd finished 11th. I can't really justify putting him any higher considering the run he's been on recently and the fact that he could just crash for 5 races in a row. But on his day he's still a very solid rider. We saw that in India last year where he finished 5th. 10th, I've gone with Fabio Di Gianantonio. Now this time last year, Digi looked like one of the worst on the grid. It's remarkable how he's turned it around over the last 9 months, and I think he's shown himself to be a really solid rider. The fact he's beating Bezzecchi in the championship at the moment is definitely worth something, and he rarely crashes as well. He's just a very solid consistent rider. I think he just about sneaks into the top 10 of this list. 9th place, I've got Maverick Viñales. Viñales is another one of those. On his day, he is one of the best on the grid, top 3. We saw that in USA and in Portimao. He was incredible. But then there's also races like Jerez this year, or in Catalonia, where he just stinks up the grid and finishes in about 10th. It's that sort of inconsistency which means I can't really justify putting Viñales any higher than 9th. Because some races he's incredible, but then some races he's just not. He's better than his teammate by now for sure, but I can't put him any higher than 9th. 8th, I've gone with Marco Bezzecchi. I know he's having a bad year at the moment, but we can't just forget the fact that he won 3 races last year on that VR46 bike. And he also had a really solid debut year. And we also can't forget that he got a podium in Jerez, and he probably should have gotten a sprint podium as well in Le Mans. He just crashed out of that. But Bezzecchi, he doesn't usually crash a lot. I'd say 8th best rider on the grid. He's a very solid rider, but I don't think he's ever going to be championship worthy material. 7th, I've gone with Brad Binder. Sometimes the commentators like to think that he's one of the best on the grid. No, he isn't, but I think 7th is good for him. Binder is one of the most aggressive riders on the grid. However, his main problem is qualifying, which is a reason why he's never been a true world-class rider. And this year especially, Acosta has been outshining him. And I think we'll see next year, when Bastianini and Vinales come in, if they both also beat Binder comprehensively, will actually turn out maybe Binder isn't as good as we thought and he just had quite crap teammates in the past. I don't think that's the case. I think Binder's still a really solid rider. He's extremely brave and aggressive, which can sometimes come at a bit of a detriment to him at times. But overall, I'd say 7th best rider on the grid. 6th, Pedro Acosta, the rookie. I think he's already the 6th best rider on the grid. And I think by the end of this year, he'll be in the top 5. Now, there might be some people who argue Acosta should be in the top 3 based on his performances so far. I think that's a bit kind. We can't forget the remarkable standard of MotoGP riders on the grid at the moment. I think we do need to remember, Acosta is still a rookie. And in this magical world I've created where everybody's on the same bike, Acosta will make mistakes. He is a rookie, he's only done 7 races so far. I think in this scenario, he would win races, but he would also make rookie mistakes. So I'd say 6th. But I think in a couple years time, he'll be top 3 easily. 5th, Enea Bastianini. Last year we weren't able to see the best of Enea, but this year he seems close to back to his best. He currently sits 4th in the World Championship and he's scored a good amount of podiums so far. He's just looked generally a solid rider. But he's more than that. We saw when he was on that Gresini bike and he won 4 races in a year. He's a really good rider. I think he might be the best on the grid in terms of saving tyres for the end of the race. His only problems are really that his qualifying isn't good enough and that he's not really ever in the position to capitalise on that late race pace, and the max he can get is 2nd. I do think he is a really talented rider, and I think he is very unlucky that he's fighting both Jorge Martin and Marc Marquez for that factory Ducati seat. I think in previous years he'd be on that bike for about half a decade. He's a really talented rider, 5th on this list. 4th, Fabio Quartararo. I know he's only 13th in the championship at the moment, but we need to take into context he's on a Yamaha who have been shocking for the past 2 years, and he's been doing really well considering the levels of that bike. The fact he even managed to score podiums on that bike last year is super impressive. And remember, he's a world champion, and if that bike hadn't fallen off in 2022, he'd be a double world champion. Quartararo is such a talented rider, and I think once Yamaha are back to their best, he'll be fighting for world championships once again. I mean, the fact he's got 11 race wins at the age of only 25 and a world championship is mega impressive. I think Fabio truly is one of the best riders on the grid, and I think some people might just forget that considering the position he's in at the moment on that Yamaha. But he is worthy of being 4th on this list. 3rd place, I've got Pecco Bagnaia, the double world champion. I've got 3rd on this list. Now, when it all clicks for Bagnaia, when the bike's on fire, when he's on the track that he likes, when he's out front leading a race, Bagnaia is the best on the grid. But when he's not in that position, when the bike's not at its best, he struggles. And I think in this scenario where everybody's been given the same bike, he would struggle to start with. I think in terms of just being able to hop on any random bike and get a good performance out of it, both Marc Marquez and Jorge Martin are better than him at it. Because they can both just hop onto any bike and get a really solid result out of it, even if it's the spare bike. Another thing with Bagnaia is that he makes quite a lot of mistakes considering he's a double world champion. In Portimao he made a mistake in the sprint race which cost him the sprint win and then crashed out of the main race. And then in Catalunya he crashed out of the lead of the sprint race on the last lap. And he made quite a few mistakes last year as well. And also, Bagnaia, he's not quite as good as the likes of Martin and Marc Marquez at just sitting behind a pack for a while in a race and then pouncing at the end of the race. We saw Marc Marquez do this expertly in his prime. He'd just sit behind a rider all race and then pounce on the last lap. I don't remember Bagnaia doing that. I think his main way of winning is just leading from the front from lap 1. He's not as versatile in his methods of winning. He sort of only really has one game plan, which is get to the front as soon as possible. And I think that combined with the fact that he makes mistakes means he'd finish 3rd in this championship in this scenario. Weekends such as USA have shown that when things aren't right for Bagnaia, he does struggle, and I think that is why I've put him 3rd in this list. In my opinion, despite the fact he's a double world champion, he's not the best rider on the grid. In 2nd of the list, I've got Marc Marquez. Marc Marquez pre-2020, when he was winning multiple world championships, he tops this list easily. But Marc Marquez post the surgery, he's still one of the best riders on the grid, but he's not at his best. Peak Marc Marquez is gone, he's been beaten up by injuries, but the fact he's still the second best rider on the grid, despite all the injuries, despite all the surgery, just shows how talented he is. Now I remember in her F, the commentators made a very good point of, I believe it's left-hand corners, Marc Marquez is still really strong out, but on right-hand corners, when he's had the surgery, he's not as strong, which makes a lot of sense. I think that Marc Marquez is still the best rider on the grid on left-hand corners, but not the best on right-hand corners, which means I'd say he's second best rider on the grid at the moment. As well as this, it's always been part of Marc's riding style, he crashes a lot. And in this magical world championship, where everyone's on the same bike, those crashes would cost him. And I don't think he would win this world championship in this scenario. Which means the winner of this list, the best rider in my opinion on the MotoGP grid, is Jorge Martin. Jorge Martin is on a different level this year. It's clear he's taken the lessons he learned from the title battle last year, and he's become a different beast because of it. And I think the fact that he's been rejected for that factory Ducati seat next year is just going to light a fire under his belly, and he's going to be even stronger throughout the year. It's quite remarkable how Jorge Martin has managed to completely cut out his crashing from his racing. In his first 2 years in the sport, he could move the crashes, but he's become a lot more consistent now, and managed to stay on the bike a lot more. In my opinion, he's leading the championship for a reason. I think he's going to win the championship, because in my opinion, he is the best rider on the grid. He's got the qualifying pace, he's got the consistency, he can lead from the front, he can sit behind people for a whole race then pounce at the end. He can win races in every way. So in my opinion, Jorge Martin is the best rider on the MotoGP grid. So that is my list of every rider in MotoGP from worst to best. I'm sure this will have angered a lot of people. So let me know in the comments, what is your list? Where would you put certain riders? Is there any riders I've put in the wrong place? Is there any riders who I've been too harsh to? Or are there any riders that I've been too kind to? Let me know in the comments. And while you're there, make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time. Bye bye.